I'm excited to be hosting the first of 4 editions of our new literary program entitled Books and Bites. I'm sure you'll be happy to hear librarian Jennifer Eisman will be hosting the next edition, and her book, Peggy, as in Peggy Guggenheim, is a story of art, family, love, and becoming oneself. That one will take place on May 12th. You'll also get to hear from librarian Maria Cristina, who's right here, who will review Taylor Jenkins Reid's upcoming fiction, Atmosphere, set against the backdrop of the 1980 Space Shuttle program on August 18. And last, but certainly not least, our library director, Janine West, will review Like Mother, a family saga exploring 3 generations of women on October 20th. Don't worry about memorizing these dates. You'll see them all listed on our beautiful bookmarks. There are some here in the room. Oh, I didn't take one. As well as on our events calendar portion of the library's website. Thank you very much to the city's amazing graphic designer for these. Today I'll be reviewing Vancouver-based author Kate MacIntosh's debut historical fiction novel, The Champagne Letters, over here, from Simon & Schuster, Canada. A special shout out and thank you to Natasha, who helped make the interview portion of today's event possible, and also donated a few copies of Kate's new novel to the library. We have a special treat in store. Kate will be joining us a little later via Zoom. Fingers crossed the technology will be on our side. Not to worry though, we did test this out beforehand. To begin, you should know that each librarian participating in Books and Bites was lucky enough to get to review the title of their choosing. Some of you might be wondering why I would choose The Champagne Letters. It's a fair question, and here is my answer. I chose The Champagne Letters because, full disclosure, I do love champagne. But also, embarrassingly enough, I knew very little about the world-famous Veuve Clicquot Champagne House, and thought by selecting this title, I'd presumably learn a little bit more about the woman behind the Yellow Label empire. These are a few things that I've discovered. Barbe Nicole Clicquot Ponsardin, yes, it's a lot, was born in 1777, the daughter of a textile manufacturer in Reims, in the Champagne region of France. Widowed at the age of only 27, she took control of her own destiny and became one of the first modern women entrepreneurs. In an era when women were excluded from the business world, she dared to assume the head of the company founded by her father-in-law in 1772, a role she undertook with passion and determination. Her creativity and lust for innovation led to many firsts in champagne. The first known vintage-dated champagne, the invention of the riddling table, and the first known blended rosé champagne. 3 inventions that revolutionized champagne making and were widely adopted by producers, becoming the basis of modern champagne production and what is still used today. For those who might be unfamiliar with the riddling process, here's an explanation from Wine Enthusiast. One of the 8+ steps used to transform still wine to sparkling is riddling, or remuage in French. Riddling happens towards the end of méthode champenoise, or traditional method of making champagne, and it is the process of periodically rotating a bottle a quarter of a turn while simultaneously tilting it until it is upside down. This movement causes sediment accumulating inside the bottle to slide down to the neck. The subsequent removal of those particles, called disgorgement, leaves the appearance of the wine clear instead of cloudy. Clicquot's solution was to cut holes in a table at varying angles so bottles could remain stable as they were turned. This special table would later become known as a pupitre, which facilitated the system for remuage. A remueur, or a bottle turner in English, could turn 20,000 to 75,000 bottles a day. But this noble skill came at a considerable cost. Hand riddling is a very labor-intensive step of the sparkling winemaking process, says Anna Diogo Draper, director of winemaking at Arteza in Napa. It can take up to 6 weeks to complete the manual riddling of a bottle of sparkling wine. In the 1970s, an invention called the gyro pallet sought to alleviate the labor costs by automating the riddling process. Gyro pallets can riddle 24 hours a day and complete a riddling cycle in about 7 days, depending on how much sediment is in the bottle, says Diogo Draper. So it's quite the process. Madame Clicquot is responsible for establishing Veuve Clicquot's brand as synonymous with excellence. Her formidable contributions earned her the nickname of La Grande Dame du Champagne. The Champagne House is proud of its motto, only one quality, the finest. The Champagne Letters is Kate MacIntosh's debut historical fiction novel, as some ladies here were saying. Kate MacIntosh is always in search of the perfect bottle of wine, a great book, and a swoon-worthy period costume drama. You'll find her in Vancouver, where in her free time, she enjoys spending time with friends, teaching writing, and listening to true crime podcasts. So why read this novel? I found the Champagne Letters to be a deeply satisfying read. Why exactly, you might ask? In a nutshell, I think it's because it's a novel that transports the reader to a dreamy, faraway place where you can dare to be the person you wouldn't be in your everyday life. Also in part because it's a novel that explores the main character's road to self-discovery, and it's told, it's told in a way that is both relatable and life-affirming. Despite the novel opening on what looks like a woman who's reached rock bottom, this novel is special in the sense that it offers up large amounts of hope, wonder, and reminds us of the benefit of making time to enjoy the beauty of the smaller joys in life. Like a long chat with a new friend, discovering a beautiful secret garden, or walking into an impromptu classical music performance that's a delight to the senses. In terms of characters, we have Natalie, who's been thrown a curveball in life and needs both a dear friend and a for sale sign on her front lawn to give her the message it's time to turn the page and embark on a new chapter in life, one where she's not playing the supporting role. There's also Natalie's best friend, and though they have their ups and downs, Molly just wants to make sure her best friend is safe and doesn't get hurt any more than she already has. An equally important character in this novel is the widow Clicquot herself, Barbe Nicole. The letters she writes to her great-granddaughter Anne find their way into this story, and they hold lessons for our main character. The letters inspire Natalie to dream bigger and live life larger than she ever would have dared to before. I always enjoy when an author chooses to interweave handwritten letters into historical fiction. This was also the case in another historical fiction I enjoyed tremendously, namely The Secret Keeper by Genevieve Graham. Though to Kate's publishing team's credit perhaps, these were much easier to read. I didn't have to strain my eyes to try to decipher the penmanship, which was an added bonus. Another key Another key female character in this novel is Sophie, who is easy to talk to and exudes the concept of French girl style. French girl style is hard to define, but most French women would say it's all about effortless elegance. French style is about looking put together without looking like you tried too hard or spent hours in front of the mirror. French style is about confidence in what you wear and who you are. French girl style is about understated charm. You might see a French girl wearing a simple tailored button-up shirt with casual black pants or blue jeans, solid colored ballet flats, and a statement silk scarf by Hermès, for example, or a unique leather bag by a local French designer. Sometimes it's the shoes, sometimes it's the jacket or the shirt, but each time a French girl wears a look at me piece, it's typically only once per outfit. The two male characters surrounding Natalie, Will and Gabrielle, this is what I imagine Gabrielle to look like, are approached in a very different light. While one of them seems somewhat ambivalent and inattentive, the other thrills Natalie with his focus on learning as much as he can about her and making sure she's fully aware he desires her. In the other timeline of this novel, there's of course Barnicole's beloved François, who she lost too soon, as well as Louis Bonne, a business partner who was a close friend of Françoise and offers Barnicole advice freely whenever she's unsure about her next move. And perhaps was there any chemistry between them as well? You'll just have to read the novel to find out for yourself. So what is special about the Champagne Letters? This is not a run-of-the-mill scorn woman story. Perhaps because at its core, this is a beautifully descriptive tale of epic arcs that transports us to lush backdrops in bustling Parisian cafes with aromas of freshly baked croissants and chocolatines, café au lait, croque-monsieurs, quiche Lorraines, and chocolate eclairs. This tale involves a woman's long overdue path to self-realization, an inner journey sprinkled in with a romance, and even with a whodunit. If you enjoy reading stories that feature a strong dose of self-exploration, female friendships both new and old, romance, sprawling quests, and plot twists, then this is exactly the right novel for you. Okay, so now I would like to read the prologue, just to give you a sense a little bit of the writing of this book. Barnicole Clicquot, Champagne, France. A letter to her great-granddaughter Anne, June 1866. If a woman does not tell her own story, then a man will surely do it for her. And even if he is a good man, he will be incapable of telling it true. Instead, he will twist and turn it so the woman in question fits his own imagination and preferences. He will recast events and experiences so he is the center of her story. In my 89 years of experience, including surviving that toad Napoleon and his wars, I have learned men always see themselves as the fulcrum that determines the balance of women and the world. If they had any idea how much is decided for them by the women in their lives, they would be shocked. They mistake loud, grand gestures for strength and disregard the quiet iron that underlies most soft things. No, my darling Anne, if anyone is going to tell you my story, it will be me, your great-grandmother, while I still can. I want to tell you all that happened because I ache to share it with someone, and the fear that my mistakes will be used against me is past. It is my hope that you can learn from me by following in my steps where wise and avoiding any ill-chosen paths. Though some will say I've always had a grandiose idea of my own importance, especially where the champagne business is concerned, that simply isn't true. Knowing one's worth isn't vanity, provided you also know your weaknesses and are honest enough to admit both. It isn't false modesty when I tell you that despite what I have accomplished, I know I will disappear from history's record. I am both a woman and a merchant, and those two things render me inconsequential in the minds of men who record important events. But their overlooking of my life makes it no less marvelous. Let that be the first of the lessons I pass to you, my precious great-grandchild. Know your worth and tell your own stories. Now, my story begins nearly 60 years ago when I discovered my husband, François, dead. So this is how the novel begins. Okay, sorry, just 1 second.
Stuck?
Yeah, just a second.
I think it's 'cause
I'm almost there.
Okay. I think it's because you can only see the cursor on the projection and not on your screen.
Here is a short summary for the Champagne letters before we move on to the interview portion of the program and invite Kate MacIntosh to speak with us. Reims, France, 1805. Barbe Nicole has just lost her beloved husband, but is determined to pursue their dream of creating the premier champagne house in France. Now named for her new identity as a widow, Veuve Clicquot. With the Russians poised to invade, competitors fighting for her customers, and the Napoleonic court politics complicating matters, she must set herself apart quickly and permanently if she and her business are to survive. In present-day Chicago, broken from her divorce, Natalie Taylor runs away to Paris. In a bookstall by the Seine, Natalie finds a collection of the widow Clicquot's published letters and uses them as inspiration to step out of her comfort zone and create a new, empowered life for herself. But when her Parisian escape takes a shocking turn, she's forced to make a choice. Should she accept her losses and return home, or fight for the future she's only dreamed about? What would you do? What would the widow do?
So I'm gonna get, Danielle, I'm gonna get you to open up your Zoom.
Okay.
And I've got Kate waiting in the wings, so I'm gonna let her in. Well, actually, I think what I'm gonna do is, Danielle, I'm gonna get you to come here instead.
What is she gonna do? What is it?
Spotlight. Hi, Kate. Hold on, we're gonna. Okay, Danielle, you're gonna come and sit here.
Okay. Well, change spot, there we go.
And I'm gonna go over there. Little bit of musical chair. Oops.
Okay. Hello, Kate. Thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Well, nice to see everybody.
Oh, you're muted, Kate.
Am I still muted? Because I show my audio is working.
I can't hear Kate.
Yeah, hold on. We're gonna put her up there, but
I can hear her.
can you hear
Someone
us?
can hear me? I can hear you. Can you hear me? Hello?
Hold on.
We can hear her on Zoom.
Not that one. We'll get
Apparently people on Zoom can hear me.
the system. Okay, how's
Yay,
that?
people on Zoom.
Can't hear.
Space over there. Speak.
Now I can't hear you. Oh, hello.
Hi.
Hi. I can hear someone.
You can hear.
How about now?
Oh, wait, now I can. Now I can. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whew.
Okay. Hang on. I'm just gonna bring up the volume a little bit. So there's some people in the room. You can't see them.
I will trust they are there having snacks.
You can't hear?
I hear her faintly.
Yeah, because it's from here. Um,
Ah, the joys of technology. And the best is this worked perfectly in the tech meeting.
always.
Always.
Hold on. How about now?
How about now?
Better.
Hello, 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 hello. I can turn, oh, let's see. I turned my volume up. Did that make a difference at all?
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, thank you very much for joining us from Vancouver this morning and even earlier morning for you over there, I'm sure. To begin, for the audience here with us today, as well as those listening in remotely, could you please tell us about how writing the Champagne Letters came about?
I would love to. First off, it's so nice to see everybody, and I am glad to have you there, and I hope you're not too badly snowed in. I know last week was quite something for everybody. All, all we're having is rain, and that felt bad enough. So, good morning, everyone. I'm so excited to be here and to be talking about the Champagne Letters. This is truly a book of my heart. And if we want to talk about when the book idea began, of course, it's complicated. So book ideas tend to sort of be like snow rolling downhill. They grow over time. So the very initial first idea is over 20 years old. At the time, I was living in Belgium, and we traveled to Champagne, France for vacation, and we did a tour, as you must, of all the vineyards in the area. And one of the places that we went to is the Veuve Clicquot Champagne House. And at the time, I wasn't even writing novels. I wanted to, but I hadn't written a novel. But at the time, I was so fascinated with the character of Madame Clicquot that I actually wrote in my travel journal, this woman would make an amazing character. So that's going back over 20 years. Then about 10 or 15 years ago, I read the wonderful biography of her, which is a nonfiction biography. It's probably even in the library. It's by Tiller Mazio, called The Widow Clicquot. And again, I just became fascinated with her. And sort of the last piece of the puzzle came into place about 7 years ago now, when I had my own divorce. And right before the divorce, which I did not see coming, we had already planned and prepaid for our vacation to France. So when this all blew up, I took our 25th wedding anniversary trip on my own. And that was the first time in quite some time I had done such a large trip on my own. And I do believe that travel is this amazing way to sort of explore and learn about yourself. And during that trip, although I didn't have the same adventures as Natalie, I began sort of making notes, and that would become the book that would become the Champagne Letters.
Oh, it's interesting.
We all have our favorite character in this novel. Which was yours?
You know, it's interesting because, of course, I love all of them. They're mine. I have such admiration for the widow, and for me, it was so exciting to have sort of the opportunity to embody this woman who I just saw as so fierce and so strong, and also to have the chance to be in the voice of someone who had lived so long ago. So I used to just love the chapters where I got to sink into her. Now, the chapters that were Natalie, of course, I loved because Natalie is a little bit of me. So the very first draft of this book was a murder mystery where she murders her ex-husband, which may tell you how my own divorce was going at that time. And then I ended up, of course, changing that and sort of scaling that back and writing a very different story as I moved through my own journey. But I loved Natalie, and it was fun to sort of see where she was coming from. And I certainly understood her feelings of sort of confusion and how do you start all over when you've spent your whole life in one particular way. But I actually enjoyed all of them. I even enjoyed Sophie from the hotel, and Gerard, which is sort of a love interest, I guess you would say, at one part. The character of Molly, her best friend, is certainly sort of a composite character of many of my friends. So there were certainly a lot of times, and I enjoyed kind of putting each of them a little bit in the story.
Of this book, which actors would you cast as Natalie, Gabrielle, and Sophie?
See, I get asked this, and this is so hard for me. This is why I will never work in Hollywood. I don't know. I would love, of course, to find a French actress, most of all, to play the widow, because I think there is a part of French culture that is embodied in French women. And I've had the fortune of knowing several French women, some Quebecois, some from France, and there is a certain sassiness, I guess is the English word. There's a certain lust for life. There's a certain strength that comes through. So I would love to do a deep dive into French actresses and find the perfect person to sort of pull that through. And I think it would be interesting because, of course, when we see the widow Clicquot, now it's through a painting, which was taken much later in her life. So she's a very heavy set woman. She's got the big sausage curls. But of course, during this time in the book, she would have been in her 30s. And she would have been this young, very vibrant, very beautiful woman with strawberry blonde hair, bright blue eyes. So I'd love to see who we could find to find her. For Natalie, I actually wondered, strangely enough, about Melissa McCarthy, who is in Bridesmaids. And I think because she is a little bit older, Natalie is in her 50s. So I don't want to do the usually Hollywood thing where we suddenly cast it with someone who's, 28, but pretending to be 50. And I think she's sort of goofy and funny. She's someone who's tripping and falling and kind of trying to find her way. And so I kind of love that idea.
Any of you have Netflix, I will encourage you to watch the movie The Widow Clicquot. There is a movie, but it is not the movie that would be made in a movie or made of this book. It is quite interesting, and some of the characters are not handled the same way as in this book, so I would encourage you to watch it if you haven't.
Yeah, I thought it was very interesting. I had the chance, I saw the Netflix show, of course, and I very much, I would agree, it's very well worth it. What was interesting is they made a love interest in particular with her primary salesperson, Louis. And that was an interesting choice for me because I could find nothing in the original records that there was anything other than a friendship between these two people. Now, I think it makes the great idea of a romance because it's a little bit, well, it's a work romance because he worked for her. And there certainly was a great deal of respect and affection between these two people. But Louis was married. In fact, she was the godmother to both of his children. So I didn't think there was a romance, but I understand Hollywood sees it differently.
How do you go about researching this novel?
This was interesting for me because I was very intimidated. I love history. I love all the TV shows that are on the public broadcasting channels. I love every BBC show that comes out. If you could see my stack of books next to my office, there are tons of nonfiction books. I'm fascinated by that. But I'm also then terrified of getting it wrong. And so I constantly imagined, someone at an event like this raising their hand and saying, did you know that the battle of such and such didn't happen at this time, it happened at this time. And so I had, if you were to see my office, big sheets of paper with timelines where I would write down everything and contrast that to the timeline of the book. I did change some things around and I made a note of that in the back of the book whenever I tried to move something to fit with the story so that people wouldn't be too angry. But I actually found, and maybe because I am someone who loves history, I, if anything, could have kept researching. So I had a large stack of books. So and this is perhaps not kissing up, but my first love is a library. And so I went to the library and did some of my own research. And then I reached out here in Vancouver. We have excellent librarians as well. And so I let them know what I was working on, and they were helpful in pulling some sources that I might not have found on my own. I also did write to the Veuve Clicquot Champagne House. And they have a history manager there who is responsible for the history of the estate and the history of the founder. Her name is a woman named Isabel. And she was amazing because she was endlessly patient when I would suddenly send her an email in the middle of the night that would say, what would have this been? Or do you know anything about this? And so she was very helpful. And I also reached out here locally to the university. So for example, at one point, I had a scene where the widow was walking along and I had written, she put her hands in her pockets. And then I stopped and I was like, were there pockets? Did women always have this desire for, I love this dress, it has pockets. Does that go all the way back? And so I reached out to the university, and there's a professor who specializes in clothing, particularly, strangely enough, underwear throughout sort of history. And I was able to reach out and ask some very specific questions. So that was helpful.
I've read that the celebrated yellow gold Veuve Clicquot label is characterized by an anchor in the middle of a star, with the star symbolizing a comet representing the Great Comet of 1811, which crossed the skies of Champagne and, as lore has it, produced an excellent vintage the following year. Had you come across this description as well? And how did you decide to interpret or imagine this pivotal time in William's journey?
So again, history nut. So I had heard of the comet of 1811. It was seen as far away as Egypt. It was seen in the New World, so it was seen here in North America as well. And it was seen obviously throughout Europe and in France. And this was, of course, when the Napoleonic Wars were going on. And just like now, when we have this tendency to be like, everything must mean something, there was a lot of rumor and speculation. What did this portend? Was this going to mean that France would be victorious? Was this meaning it was a portent that Napoleon would fall? So there was a lot of questioning. And I think whenever the world is in upheaval, which perhaps feels more true now, unfortunately, than even when I was writing the book, we're looking for something to guard us, to guide us. When I was growing up, my mother used to say to me, which she got from my grandmother, she would always say, you have to be your own North Star. And in fact, that's something I've always sort of used in my own life, where if I'm getting off track, I always think, am I being my own North Star at this moment? And I think the comet was that for a lot of people. It was a time of sort of reckoning. And it was something to sort of think about. And I think the widow saw so many things as a symbol that she was on the right track. She very much wanted this to happen. And I don't think that we can understand how difficult that must have been. I mean, women weren't running businesses at the time. You know, there was massive war going on. There were shortages. Everything was against her and encouraging her to have a quiet life, to remarry, to raise her daughter, to perhaps have more children, to surrender any business to a new husband. So for her to keep going, I think must have taken such incredible personal resolve and strength. And I think she chose to see the comet as one of those. And certainly it didn't hurt that as it was often called, the comet wine was considered to be one of the premier vintages. And the anchor that is burned into her cork was a sign that she decided to use for her house from almost the very beginning. And I ended up looking up, the anchor is considered a sign of hope. So again, I think you can put that into the star and it sort of adds that. And she burned that image of a star and an anchor into her corks very early, which was one of, again, I'll never ask someone who's interested in history because we're like, that reminds me of something. At that time, there weren't labels on wine. We think now of such of the distinctive label of Veuve Clicquot with the bright egg yolk label. But at the time, labels were not a thing. And she was so proud of that wine. There's one of the letters from her where she talks about, everyone must know this is mine. And so she was one of the first people to start stamping the corks so that when people would get the wine, they would see the cork with its distinctive marking and would know, oh, this is a Veuve Clicquot wine. So that was the beginning. And of course, labels would come after that.
How do you choose which elements to fictionalize and which ones not?
It was a difficult dance, I would say, in terms of deciding, because I wanted to be true to who she was. And I've had the experience, some people may have seen the movie that came out with Joaquin Phoenix, the Napoleon movie, that was out not that long ago. And that movie came out when I was finishing up, this book was already in production. And I was so angry because they took these huge leeways with a lot of the historical record. And I was like, that didn't happen. That didn't happen. And so I found myself, so I wanted to be as true as I possibly could be to the true events of the story. But I also recognize it is fiction and it's meant to be, hopefully, an enjoyable read, and which means it needs to be concise and it needs to sort of move for the pacing of the novel. And so it was important for me to try and keep that going and moving along. And for example, one of the things that the widow is best known for is she discovered and made popular the idea of riddling, which was the idea of turning bottles sur point and turning them so that the yeast would go down into the neck of the bottle. By all accounts, she did that in about 1816, which is after the period of the book. The book ends after 1814 for her. And so I had to make the decision that I actually was going to move that up in the timeline because I really wanted to show not only was she this great business leader, but she was an innovator. She was the first to make pink champagne. She was doing a lot of things that were brand new in this brand new industry. And so I wanted to sort of show that. It was interesting because, of course, I feel now like I know her. I don't, I have no, I'm not a distant relative. I'm not any of those things. But I wanted to honor her, and it felt very important to me to be that. But I felt I could almost hear her, over my shoulder. Like I would never say that. And again, when I was writing Natalie is loosely based upon me. It's not me, but it's loosely based. So that character was so easy, but hers, that sort of strength, that sort of attitude, I needed to sort of hear her a little bit.
Like with prospective writers listening in today.
Oh, I have so much advice for writers. I'll take the rest of the time to keep talking, if you let me do that. I love writing. I can think of nothing better than the chance to have imaginary friends and then to get to share them with everyone. So doing events like this library event for me are so exciting because this is a story that's been in my head almost 20 years to some degree. And so to have the chance to have that imagination become a real book and then become something that other people are reading and responding to is spectacular. Advice that I would give is just to know that that's the end of the marathon. And there is a whole lot that comes before that. And so a lot of writing is you alone with your laptop or your notebook, however you choose to do your writing. And so I would encourage people, one, to celebrate all along the journey, because it is a very long journey. And if you save that celebration for the end, it's difficult. I have a friend here in town who's also a writer, and she found these little tiny mini bottles of Prosecco that you can buy. It's about a glass and a half. And she bought them, and she would put 10,000 words. So every time she got to another 10,000 words in her book, she could open one of those little bottles of champagne. And I stole that idea from her, where I celebrated, starting the book, and I celebrated, when I had it, 10,000 words, 20,000 words, 30,000 words, 40. There was a lot of champagne drinking in this book. So there was a lot of opportunities. I celebrated when I had a first draft. I celebrated when I got feedback. I celebrated certainly when my agent was able to sell the book. I celebrated when I saw the cover for the very first time. And so I sort of celebrated each of those, and that made it easier. I love that cover still. It made it easier to sort of to get through all of those things. And I would certainly say to writers, it's a long journey. So surrounding yourself with good people who will sort of encourage you is really important. And to find your own North Star, I guess, in terms of what is it you want to communicate and what is it you're trying to write.
Right now that we should all be reading as well.
Oh, there are so many good things to be reading. Let me think. What are some of my favorites that I have read recently? I did have a chance to read, which is a sneak peek. It's not out until I think next Tuesday, is Susanna Kearsley, who is another wonderful Canadian writer, has a book coming out called The King's Messenger, and it's historical fiction taking place in Scotland, and that one will be out next week. And Susanna Kearsley, if people haven't read her, she's also a wonderful writer for doing sort of dual timelines, which I always enjoy. And I also read, on a very different side of things, if people enjoy Liam Moriarty's latest book, I'm going to screw up the thing, Here One Moment, I think is what it's called. And it's her brand new book that just came out. And it's a very interesting book where people receive a prediction about what age they will die and of what cause. And those predictions begin to come true. And it's really a question about what do you do with this sort of one great and glorious life that you have, and what would you change about it if you could?
To hear this book, because there was a book a few years back by Lily Benjamin on this very topic, where fortune tellers told each of the children when and how they would die, and then this is different, okay.
You're reading the Leanne Moriarty?
Yeah. I think it is another, maybe a good reminder for writers in the room. I think there's always this fear that someone's going to steal your idea. And the truth of the matter is that there really aren't any new ideas. There's just your interpretation of that idea. And I can guarantee if I were to read the book that you were just talking about, where the prediction are given to each of the kids, there would be similarities, but there would be, yeah, so many differences as well. And so, I don't really worry. So when I was writing this book and I was coming to the end of it, someone said, oh, there's another book out there that's also about, Madame Clicquot. And I didn't read it while I was writing the book because I was like, I don't want to have it in my head. I have a very personal idea of who she is. So I didn't read it later. But everyone is going to have their own story. There was the film that came out, and if I'm ever lucky enough to have a film made of this book, again, I'm quite sure it will be very different as well. And so I sort of encourage writers just to tell the story that makes them excited.
And can you share a sneak peek of your next book?
I would be happy to share a sneak peek. So I became very interested. There's a woman called the Countess of Castellone, who was the most beautiful woman by all accounts in Italy in the mid 1800s. And at that time, Italy was not yet a country. It was different sort of states, but they were trying to become a country. And the group that was trying to unify Italy came to her and they said, clearly, you are the most beautiful woman in all of Italy. How do you feel about going to France and perhaps sleeping with Napoleon III and seeing if a little bedroom diplomacy might encourage him to help us out? And she did. And she went to France. She had an affair with Napoleon III. He then threw his might in the French army behind the efforts. They united Italy. And then the diplomats took all the credit for it, and she was sort of left out of that telling of history. And she would go on. She was called the original selfie queen. She became very interested in early photography. And unlike most people who, if they were lucky at that time, had maybe one photo taken of themselves at their wedding, she had over 300 photos taken of her. And all different sorts. She wore costumes and outfits and all sorts of amazing things. And so I want to write a book about another woman who's a photographer in the present day, and the Countess's story happening back in the mid 1800s, which is giving me a chance to go back to France, which is never a bad decision.
That sounds wonderful. We can't wait to read it.
Thank you.
Are you in the middle of your draft right now?
Correct. So there are stacks of books. I'm learning a lot about early photography that I did not know. And I'm having a lot of fun sort of learning about that sort of time period and what was happening. And she's a fascinating, fascinating character. And I think one of the things that is interesting is she had a lot of problems at the end of her life, because as she got older, she lost her looks. And so in fact, she would only go out if she was fully veiled. And in fact, there's a very famous Impressionist painting called A Woman in the Veil, that is her, because she would only be seen in public veiled. In 2000, the Metropolitan Museum in New York did an exhibit of her photography, contrasting photographs taken earlier in her life with those later. And they said, it's quite interesting that she allowed herself to be photographed when she was so, and I'm going to put finger quotes around this, decrepit. She was 52. And that was in 2000. So I'm very interested in this importance of beauty And what does it mean to be beautiful? And what does it mean for a woman to define herself by her beauty? And what does it mean if you then lose that beauty? So she walled herself up in her French apartment. She would allow nothing reflective in the apartment, no mirrors, no silverware, nothing where she could catch a glimpse of herself because she was so distraught to be losing her looks.
Everyone's afraid.
Her next book, well, she told us a little bit about it. Yeah. Do you have any idea when this book might come out, Kate? I know I'm putting you on the spot.
Everybody's ready to read, which is fantastic. I am hoping for 2026. So it won't be this year for sure, but
Far away. 2026.
but there'll be so many good books. I know there'll be so many good books to keep people busy and reading between now and then. That's never the problem. There's always too much to read, not enough.
So in the prologue, where Nicole is talking about how she will not be remembered in history because it is men who record history. Unfortunately, or well, fortunately, I mean, that's not true because she did leave her mark on history, and we are talking about her today. So do you want to speak about that a little bit?
I think what's interesting is she was a huge player in history. And yet we are talking about her, and there's been sort of a resurgence where she's kind of become a little bit more popular. But when I first decided to write the book, other than the biography by Tillier Mazio, there's not multiple, like if you look at Napoleon, which was another person that I researched, if you want to read about Napoleon, there are hundreds, if not thousands of books written about Napoleon, about Josephine, about all aspects of his life. Every single corner's been sort of nudged into and read about, and there's all these things. There are certainly books that reference Madame Clicquot, but I could find only one biography that was about her. And I do think there is an element of she was a woman, and women were not considered major players in historical events, and they tended to sometimes be sort of secondary characters. And I've been surprised the amount of times, now part of this is a lot of people have no idea what basic French is. And so when you say veuve means widow, they didn't realize even that. They just thought it was meant bubbly wine, bubbly cocoa or something. And so to tell people like, oh, well, actually it means widow, and she was a real woman. And a lot of people don't know that even if they enjoy the champagne. They don't necessarily know that there was a real person behind that. So I'm very excited that there's been sort of this renewed interest in her, to sort of have her story told. And before I was a writer, I worked as a therapist and a counselor. And one of the things that I learned in graduate school, and I'm still very interested in, is the idea that it's not what happens to you, it's the story that you tell yourself about what happened to you. So my specialty was working with people who had been in traumatic injuries or illness. So I worked with a lot of people who lost limbs or were burned or had become paraplegic or so forth. And it was always interesting to me when I would meet them in the hospital. You would meet two people with maybe the same type of injury, and one person would be telling the story of, this was horrible, but I'm the kind of person, I pick myself up, I'm the person who will go on. And someone who might even sometimes have a much less serious injury, who would be saying, this is it, my life is over, I will never do anything again. And you could almost predict as the therapist who would have the better outcome at the end of the rehabilitation period. And so I've always believed that, and I certainly became convinced of it the longer I worked as a therapist. And so I wanted to put in the book this idea that she says at sort of the end of that prologue, which is to tell your own story. And so to take control of your own narrative, and none of us, unfortunately, can avoid difficult things happening. I've had, friends who unfortunately have lost a child. I've had, known people who've been in accidents or had financial difficulties or lost a job or gotten divorced. Very few of us get through life unscathed, unfortunately. But to me, what is interesting is, given that those things will happen, and unfortunately happen to all of us, will you take control of the story that you tell about that? And for me, that's the real power. And that was one of the things that I loved again about the widow, is I felt she took control of her life. And so that prologue for me was one of the first pieces that I wrote. And it sort of helped guide me through the story as I would go along.
There is sort of an offshoot story in the book about wine fraud. Can you tell us how you researched this aspect? Because that's a whole story in itself.
Well, one of the things when I was writing this book, my accountant pointed out to me that any wine or champagne that I drank during the research and writing of the book was tax deductible under Canadian law. And so I made free and good use of that. And there's a wonderful wine store here close to me where there's a sommelier that offers classes, so you can taste and try all different types of wine. And I wanted to learn much more about how wine is made and produced so that I could have some of that knowledge. And one of the things that she mentioned, of course, was that wine fraud is one of the biggest cons out there, and it tends to go under the radar. And it goes under the radar for a few reasons. So one, a lot of people who buy fraudulent wine have no idea that they have fraudulent wine because they never open it. So a lot of these rare bottles are bought strictly for bragging rights. They're put into a dark cellar so someone can say, I own a bottle of 1942 such and such. They don't intend to drink it because, of course, that's the beauty and difficulty of wine, is it's once you drink it, it's gone. You don't get to, it's not like a painting where you can keep it on the wall and look at it for generations, right? Once you drink it, it's gone. But if you also don't drink it, have you truly enjoyed it? I guess is the question. But for a lot of people, they don't know they have fraudulent wine because they don't drink it. The second reason, of course, is if you do drink it, a lot of people talk a big story about wine, but they don't know. So you see all these people who swirl it around and, oh, I taste currants, and I taste, oh yes, hints of this and blackberry, and, but the truth is some people have no idea. And they've done a lot of studies where they've put poor quality wine into a glass and a good quality of wine in another glass, and told people that the low quality was the very expensive wine. And a lot of people cannot tell the difference between the two. It's purely what you're told. So when you go to a restaurant and they say, oh yes, this wine is definitely you think, oh, definitely it tastes better than this other wine that I might drink at home. And the last piece of that, of course, is so many things can happen to wine. Wine is a very delicate thing kept in the bottle. So if the bottle becomes too hot or too cold or is kept in bright sunlight, the wine can go off. So even if you do have a very educated palate and you taste that wine and you think that doesn't taste like what I would expect for what I bought, there are so many other reasons why it could be off that people don't know. And so they may walk away from it. So people who are thieves have cottoned on to that. There's a wonderful nonfiction book called The Billionaire's Vinegar that details about wine fraud in particular. And there was one fellow in California who made 24 million in one wine auction alone, that would later come out to all be fraudulent wine. He was out in San Francisco. He had this whole printer where he was printing off labels, and they would soak them in tea and then put them in the oven, and they would replicate these labels and put them on. There was also a fellow who said to have discovered Thomas Jefferson's hidden cellar of wine in Paris. And he sold most of those bottles for about 250,000 US dollars each. And he probably would have gotten away with it, but after he sold all of this hidden cellar, he found another hidden cellar of Thomas Jefferson wine. So he got quite greedy and he found another hidden cellar. And it was with that second sale that more people started to say, and going down the research hole. And in fact, because Thomas Jefferson did spend time in France, but people started to do research and they certainly did not have that much wine in his cellar in France. And so it would turn out that this fellow had bought all these antique bottles at flea markets throughout France, washed them, cleaned them, filled them with cheap wine, and sold them for a lot of money. So to me, I find that stuff rather interesting. And so I wanted to sort of have that a little bit of an element of how perhaps not everything is what it seems.
Thank you so much, Kate. I'm just gonna ask the audience here if anyone has a question before I let you go. Any questions?
Can she tell the different wines apart?
Can I tell the wines apart?
Yes.
Maybe a bit better. I think I have a more educated palate. Like I had always enjoyed wine, and so I certainly have taken now a couple of years of classes. But do I think I could be fooled? 100%. I can definitely tell the difference between a boxed wine and a beautiful bottle of wine. But once you start getting over about sort of $40 a bottle, I don't believe I have the palate that can tell the difference between those bottles. Which is nice because it means you can drink less expensive wine and feel good about it. So yeah, I think I can tell some differences now. I was very excited. I went out for dinner with my parents and my dad was teasing me about being the fancy sommelier in the family. And so when the waiter came around and we ordered a bottle of wine, he said, "Oh, my daughter has to pick it. She's the sommelier." And they were all laughing at me. And the woman brought the wine, she poured it, I tasted it. And I was like, this doesn't taste right. It doesn't taste like a Sauv Blanc, which was what we had ordered. It actually tastes more like a Riesling. And they all were like, "Oh, Miss Fancy Pants says it." And then the waiter looked down and he was like, "Oh my God, I brought the wrong bottle." And so I had such a moment of where I wanted to high five, like, but being able to tell the difference between a Riesling and a Sauv Blanc doesn't really take sommelier level tasting, but I still felt pretty proud of myself.
Well, we're impressed.
Yeah, I was impressed with myself.
Okay, thank you so much, Kate, for speaking with us today. It was great to hear from you, and for those who didn't read it yet, please do read the Champagne Letters. It is definitely worthwhile, and we look forward to your next projects in 2026, which also sounds fantastic.
Thank you so much for having me, and thank you to the library and for everyone who came out or who came online. I very much appreciate it.
Bye-bye. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.